The era of good feelings today, the period of 1815 to 1824, at the conclusion of the War of 1812. It also was the time we can consider of one-party politics in the United States, with the Federalist Party essentially over and done with, except as some members of the House and Senate, and also within the state governments, especially in New England, where the Federalist Party had always been strong. But for the most part, it was given that name, the era of good feelings, after the election of 1816, when we had an overwhelming victory, the first election after the War of 1812. So let's go through this and see what we're talking about. We're also going to consider the idea that the aftermath of the War of 1812 we might consider to be a wake-up call for the United States. There had been shortcomings in the, we might say, financial and infrastructure of the United States. They didn't use the word infrastructure back then. They would use the word communication, transportation. They would talk about the need for both the state governments and the federal governments to initiate programs for internal improvements, roads, maybe even canals, faster ways to get across water. National turnpikes might be a consideration as well. So let's talk about the aftermath of the war. Again, it had been hard to move soldiers and supplies because we're still very much a colonial nation as far as our communication and transportation networks were concerned. We also had tried to run the war, and the year before the war started, without a national bank. Madison, as president, had been against the recharter of the National Bank in 1811 when it expired, but he's going to support it after 1815. It had been hard to run the war without a bank. So we see the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States in 1816, the last year of Madison's presidency. And it is given yet another 20-year charter up until 1836. So we'll still call it the BUS, in this case the Second Bank of the U.S. It was still controversial as far as the government being able to create this institution for a relatively small sector of the population, those who worked in business and finance. Nevertheless, the bank was going to be legitimized during the era of good feelings. And that's important for us to consider. That's where we'll finish up today's discussion and talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so we have the recharter of the bank. The other area where the United States experienced some need for change and people began to question the role of government happened when we consider that when the war ended, there was an outcry among the early manufacturing in the United States that we should protect the new industries that are making cloth, that are making other products that are also produced overseas in Europe. And so what took place was that Congress in 1816 voted a tariff. And sometimes it's been called a protective tariff because it protects American-made industries. So let's take a look at a slide. I found this on the interwebs. It's a pretty good slide to illustrate this. Very simple about how it works. And early on, in 1816, the tariff was seen as a very patriotic measure. People in the North and South supported it. Henry Clay supported it, one of the war hawks. John Calhoun, a Southerner, supported it. So there was this nationalistic feeling in the United States after 1815. We had fought the English to a draw. We even beat them pretty badly in the last battle that happened after the war ended, but it gave the nation this kind of sense of pride. But it also produced in the nation the idea that we may have to attempt to, we would today say, modernize. And one area where we saw development of the American economy is that during the time of the war, and even before it, we might say beginning with the embargo in 1807, if products were not coming into the United States because the embargo stopped exports, but it also really stopped imports as well. So it was one of those moments in American history where folks began to produce things traditionally made in Europe. And this is how the tariff works. American cloth, you can see it here in the slide, costs, let's just say as a nice round number, $4 a roll. British-made cloth also costs $4 a roll, or maybe even less. So if there's something that's produced within the United States that's also produced in Europe, the tariff is going to put, in this case, a 25% tariff. 25% of the value is $1. So now British-made cloth will cost $5. It artificially inflates the price of the foreign-made product. Very simple to understand. Now, if we don't make it in the United States, if there's a product that is made in Europe and not in the United States, there's no reason to have a tariff because we don't make an American version of it. Let me give you another modern example. Cars. We tariff cars. Now, it's a little confusing because a lot of cars that are supposedly German or Japanese are built in the United States. I mean, BMW builds cars in Spartanburg, South Carolina. So we would put a tariff on the foreign product so that people would buy Dodges and Fords and Chevys instead of Mazdas and Toyotas and Nissans. That's a modern example, the tariff, protective tariff, because it protects American industry. The infancy of American industry begins during the time of the embargo and up to the beginning of 1815. Here's an example of what we're talking about. This is one of the new New England mills that were constructed in that decade from 1807 to 1815, 1816. You may have heard of the Lowell Mills. Here's a picture of how they would be constructed, use water power. They would employ young women in New England, and they would take cloth, they would make cloth from cotton. Cotton is going to become, as we see it, as everything gets tied together, a major American crop for export, some of which is sent up to New England and made into cloth. So it gets back to the whole idea, if it's made in the United States, if it's also made in Europe, because the British want to start trade with the United States again. There's no doubt about it. The war ends in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars, and for a brief period, things look really good as far as, hey, it's going to be fantastic. The war's over. Trade will begin, but the U.S. says not so fast. We're going to put in place that tariff. So it has national, we might say national support in 1816. That's going to change. Like the bank, the tariff will be a controversial topic going into the 1820s as the United States adds more items to the tariff, as the North and South begin to develop in stark differences, with the North being more and more industrialized and the South doubling down on agriculture and the slave economy and those major cash crops. Okay, so we've covered two of the areas that we need to be talking about. Three major areas that we have to consider. First, the banking. We talked about the Bank of the United States, the tariff, and also the idea of internal improvements. This is transportation. Transportation, should it be funded at the national level, at the federal government level? This was, today we assume, yes. I mean, you pass a sign on the highway, you bounce over a pothole in Louisiana, and you might see a road sign that says the federal dollars are $30 million, state dollars are $1 million, and there's a combination between the state and the federal government about paving or rebuilding a new road, connecting Interstate 49 north of Shreveport all the way into Arkansas, which has been going on for a number of years. Well, people began to ask questions. Should the federal budget be used at the national level to build roads? Where should the roads be built? And if you get a road through your state, is that giving preferential treatment to one section of the country or another? And if there's no national support for these internal improvements, sometimes the state take their own ideas and build them on their own. In New England, we see examples of toll roads being built. I don't see as many of them in the South, but up north to this day, to help pay for roads that are being built, modern paved roads. The states would allow these turnpike companies to exist. People would pay a toll, and those people who built the road would get their money back, and the investors and the state as well would get money back to maintain the road. What about the national road? What about any kinds of support for a road that's going to go across or connect parts of the East to the quickly developing West in the period after the War of 1812? That's a good question. And that leads to the construction of what's known as the National Road. Sometimes it's called the Cumberland Road because it actually started out and part of it was connected from Cumberland in Maryland. After the War of 1812, you can see the National Road. There's really one road being constructed at the national level. Are the states building roads? Absolutely. But this road connects Cumberland in western Maryland beyond into Wheeling, Virginia, obviously now West Virginia, and it, I think, is representative about what section of the country is growing at a rapid rate. It's the old Northwest Territory. This takes several decades to construct, and so what's going to take place is that we see the slow building by federal dollars of the national road. So short of any kind of national project for a number of roads, the states take their own initiative. And the most impressive state initiative happens here in New York State. This slide represents the construction of the Erie Canal, which is begun after the War of 1812. It takes 8 or 9 years. I believe it's completed in 1825. And what the Erie Canal does, you can see the main canal that begins near Albany and Troy. They use the waterways of New York, the Mohawk River. They build it over what's called in the area right above where it says New York. Those are called the Finger Lakes because they look like fingers in a hand. So you dig this ditch, and it's, by the way, 360 miles. That is the length of the Erie Canal. Not very wide, but what this does is allow folks, now obviously, if you look at the right side of the map, you see the Hudson River below Albany. The Hudson River will connect New York State to New York City. The Hudson River obviously empties into the Atlantic. So you have the Atlantic connected to the Hudson and west all the way across the Erie Canal. It's a man-made trench that lets out near Buffalo. As a result, a few things happen. You connect the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. And when you connect that to the Great Lakes, let's go back to the other map, we can see New York, big picture here, connected to the Great Lakes and the Northwest Territories, which will rapidly become states in the 18 teens. It also continues the development of Western New York. I mean, these stops along the Erie Canal. This is what it would look like when it was done. And you would have barge traffic here. Again, it's not the, well, let's just say, most exciting way to get across one end of New York to another. But what it does do is reduce your transportation costs. They figured out after it was completed, your transportation costs drop 90%. I mean, if you ran a business today and someone told you, I know a method by which one element of what you have to pay for, you could drop by 90%, you would absolutely grab that opportunity. And you might think, well, you know, someone towing, some mules pulling your barge across this man-made trench, is this any faster than roads? Well, yes. And it was a complicated process. You had to build different locks. You know, you had to flood the different locks so that at different elevations, these barges that you see here, dragging a combination of goods and products, would be able to move as you got farther west towards the elevations in New York State. And it worked. And what is a result of the Erie Canal when it's completed in 1825? And the governor who sponsored it, the governor of New York, he was mocked and made fun of. Oh, this is a wasteful project. It's not going to work. But he turns out he was absolutely correct about it. The other development, of course, is that you see labeled at the bottom of this slide the other canals that are connected to the Erie Canal. And after the Erie Canal is finished, other states begin to build canals as well. This is the best way to move products across from one waterway to another. If you don't build roads, and roads are expensive and they take a long time, this is an alternative. Because the other item, we might say, technological development, so we've got the bank, we have, and now we're talking about internal improvements, we've got the tariff, but what you begin to see on American rivers, beginning at the very end of the War of 1812, are steamboats. You take steam power, you harness it to a paddle wheel. This is a side wheel. Also, you've seen them, of course, on the back. Sometimes they build these, casinos to look like old steamboats, and some of them are functioning steamboats. And so this is a method by which you can use steam power to go against the current. And we might think, yeah, everyone, you can row your boat against the current, right? It's pretty difficult to do that. Now, if you were traveling from a place like Louisville, Kentucky to New Orleans in the 18 teens and the 1820s, you would use the Ohio River, you would use the Mississippi River, and you would sail south. When you got to New Orleans, you would take the boat that you had used, you would break it apart and sell it for firewood, and then you'd walk back. So no one before steam power ever thought, how am I going to go against the current? Well, you didn't. It would take you 3 times as long. And what the steamboat was able to do is take a trip that took 3 weeks and reduce it to 1. So the speed of, we might say, transportation. Later it's going to affect communication. We'll see the birth of the telegraph. We will have canals built, we will have roads built, and then we'll see the infancy of what's called the rail car. Obviously that's the railroad in the 1830s and the 1840s, which for the most part is something that's pretty experimental. So let's go back to the notes. In 1816, we have the first election after the War of 1812. And in the 1816 election, someone who had served in James Madison's cabinet, James Monroe, he had served at one point as Secretary of State, Secretary of War. In fact, he served as both together because there was such chaos in Madison's cabinet, obviously during the War of 1812 and the very embarrassing burning of Washington, D.C. So here's Monroe. He is the last of what has been called, with the number of presidents who come from Virginia, the Virginia dynasty: Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Each of these 3 gentlemen served 2 4-year terms. And James Monroe has often been called one of the last presidents to be a veteran of the American Revolution. That's partly true. I would count Jackson as well, but that's to be debated. He was only a teenager during the American Revolution. Nevertheless, it's Monroe who is presiding over one-party government. The Federalists run their last presidential candidate in 1816. He is resoundingly defeated. And it is a newspaper in the Northeast that coins the phrase, "This is an era of good feelings." One-party government. So it's easy for us to understand a few things. Number one, one-party government. The Democratic Republicans, the old Jeffersonian Republican Party, or simply the Republicans. The Republicans are the party, and much like the modern Democratic Party of 2020, the Republican Party of 2020, there are differences of opinion on different subjects. So just to say that there is only one political party nationally, which is mostly true, it doesn't mean that amongst Monroe's party, there is of course differences on some of the issues such as internal improvements and the Bank of the United States and the tariff. Some people objected to the tariff in Monroe's party. They said we should have free trade, meaning no barriers on trade. Others were hesitant to give the Bank of the United States a new charter. So again, though it may be one-party government, it's not as easy as it seems. It's not as cut and dry. There are differences of opinion, and now those splits will become much larger. They'll help create what we will later call the second-party system in the 1820s. There are also other developments that challenges the notion that this is a so-called era of good feelings. Something that happens, again, this is a representation of the technological front in the United States, is that during the 1770s and 1780s, one promising crop in the United States had been, of course, cotton. The problem with cotton is that the slaves who worked cotton could only process about 1 pound of cotton per day because you had to pick in the bowl of cotton seeds out of the cotton plant. So a few changes happened even before the War of 1812. The most significant is represented in this slide. The gentleman on the left is from New England, actually. His name is Eli Whitney, and Whitney created what's called the cotton engine in 1791. The cotton engine allows those who plant cotton, white and black, slaves who are rapidly moving to new areas of the United States, to process now 50 pounds of cotton a day. It's a complete and absolute game changer. Another host of factors also help in the development of the cotton economy in the South. So you have it, it's said here one more time, the cotton boom. It's accurate to call it a boom. One worker can clean 50 pounds of cotton per day. So cotton and slavery expand to the West. The Old South gives birth to the new Deep South. You can see in this slide here how cotton would be, after picked, brought in from the fields. White and black labor, mostly black labor, because people were beginning to wonder if the institution of slavery would move to the Deep South, beyond Georgia. And there were numerous factors connected to the War of 1812 that made it happen. The first we can see on this map. This map illustrates the movement of African Americans from the Upper South to the Deep South from 1808 up until the end of the American Civil War. So let me talk about briefly a few factors that are at play here. In 1808, if you remember our talk on the Constitution said that Congress cannot interfere with the overseas slave trade until 1808. And in 1808, Congress passed a law saying that the United States would no longer participate in the overseas slave trade. It led many to think in the North, hopefully, that slavery might be on the decline, but it also concerned folks in the South. How would we obtain slaves if we are going to indeed move into new lands in areas of what are now Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, the Missouri Territory? They weren't exactly sure if the overseas slave trade stopped, what would happen next. And the answer is that people didn't realize that by 1808, the population of African Americans was growing nearly as quickly as the white population, which means doubling about every 20 years. So births, they call it natural increase, where births of white or black folks are much larger than deaths. Again, this is an important corner to turn when we go back to, let's say, early Virginia, where deaths were eclipsing births, and people coming over from England was the only way to keep that colony alive. We saw this change in the Chesapeake among the black population in the 1740s and 50s. It happened to South Carolina on the eve of the American Revolution. I don't think people understood or really acknowledged this dramatic change. It's very important to understand. So that's one factor. A second is cotton, obviously, that we talked about. The third connects to the War of 1812, or the war within the war. That war was, of course, the Creek War. Now, where you're seeing the domestic slave trade very much play out from the Upper South, the old colonial South. By that I mean Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, even South Carolina. Move to the Deep South. We're talking about Western Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Where that movement happens, it is a result of a couple of factors. One is cotton and the cotton engine. Now cotton is the king crop. The other factor that takes place is that in the territory of Alabama, in the territory of Mississippi, which will become states very quickly after the War of 1812, that area was turned over from the Creeks, who had been defeated by Andrew Jackson during the Creek War in 1813 and 1814. So it's a perfect storm of factors that happen. The slave population in the lower South, you can see the chart, the bottom chart of the two. The Upper South population continues to increase, but not as dramatically, you can see. That's very important for us to understand. So there we have it, the domestic slave trade, the cotton economy, the addition of new states, not only in Indiana and Illinois in the old Northwest Territory, but also in Mississippi and Alabama. Louisiana became a state in 1812, and what's often eclipsed by the discussion of cotton is the fact that areas from, if you look on the map, if you see Vicksburg in what's Mississippi, Natchez, follow that south to Baton Rouge, down to New Orleans, that becomes a corridor of sugar production. And slaves who were leaving the Saint-Domingue or Haiti rebellion, remember that was the key factor that allowed France to give up on a new North American empire and sell Louisiana to the United States. That slave rebellion is the overriding factor. Well, slaves from that slave rebellion moved out of Saint Domingue, Haiti, and came to areas of New Orleans. And they brought with them the ability to plant sugarcane. So we often talk cotton, 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 but sugarcane is a very important cash crop as well, grown in the southern areas or the deep south, Vicksburg all the way down to New Orleans. It later becomes literally a millionaire's row in land, in sugar production, and of course the ownership of slaves. Okay, let's go back to the notes before Dr. McDonald completely loses his train of thought. Okay, this ties into what's going to be the final episode in our story today. Everything looks great as far as the economy in the aftermath of the War of 1812. Europe is at peace for the first time in over 20 years. The United States, our ships are traveling around the world without being harassed by either the British or the French. And the Bank of the United States, which had been rechartered, all of a sudden is giving out loans for people to buy land and to buy slaves and to buy the equipment they need to grow grain in the Northwest, to grow cotton in the Southwest, and also in the Deep South to grow sugarcane. Everything looks great. You know, you can loan out the money if land prices are high, if the return on cotton is high. But there are a few factors that will create what we call in American history. It's our first sustained depression in the United States. Back then, they didn't call them depressions. They called them panics. In this case, we're talking about the Panic of 1819. It was not a recession. It was a sustained depression. It lasted about 3 years. And so the Panic of 1819, let's go back to the slide here and consider the factors that are at work. The first, and some people like to blame what might be the villain in this story, popular conception or perception, I should say. The perception in this story is that the Bank of the United States was the villain. The bank was calling in loans. People were having their land foreclosed, having to sell slaves. But the bank has been accused of not regulating paper money very well. And so the value of money became inflated, and that was not a good, again, determining factor into what was going to take place afterwards. The price of land began to decline. And those who had invested in land with the hope that cotton and grain prices would be high and the demand for it from overseas would be high. Well, if the price begins to decline, you can't pay your mortgage. You can't pay the loan that you got to buy the land or slaves. Another factor, this is, I think, the third one in this slide. It says the demand for American goods drop off. Things were very unsettled in Europe, obviously, after the Napoleonic Wars ended, and there was a demand for American-grown products, cash crops mostly, until Europe recovered from the war. Then they required less, so their demand went down. That meant prices began to decline as well. And so when these banks, managed in many cases by the Bank of the United States, needed repayment of loans, people didn't have the money. People were filing for bankruptcy. There's no bankruptcy laws in the United States in 1819. When you lose everything, you lose everything. There's no bankruptcy protection, and it's really very much an embarrassment for a lot of folks. So this is why you get this panic. And a lot of people want to say that the Bank of the United States, how dare they? They were the one that, of course, had called in these loans. And, banks want their money back. There's no doubt about it. Nevertheless, everyone who criticizes the bank, in the same year we have this panic, the same year that this, again, run on banks and people try to, again, make payments and not get foreclosed on, not go into bankruptcy, all of this takes place. In the background, we have another important Supreme Court decision. Now, there's 3 that you need to know for the class. 2 of them will be covered in the next exam. We already talked about Marbury versus Madison. The second one is McCulloch versus Maryland, and this decision happens to come along the same time as the year of the panic. So the Supreme Court had to weigh in on the issue of whether or not the bank, the bus, was legal. So the Bank of the United States had branches operating in different states. And in one case, the gentleman who was running the Maryland branch, he thought that he could actually get from the state of Maryland, would be able to tax the Maryland branch of the Bank of the United States. So the question was, first of all, could this state tax this federal institution? The second question, of course, is the bank constitutional? Which it seems to be constitutional. Congress passed a law. Jefferson and Madison were never a fan of it. And then Madison kind of changes his tune at the end of the War of 1812 and reluctantly says, with gritted teeth, oh, shoot, I guess we do need the bank. And the other question, of course, is would the court be able to weigh in on this question? In 1819, the same gentleman who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the Marbury versus Madison decision is Chief Justice again. His name, of course, is John Marshall. We talked about him a little bit. So here are the questions and the answers behind the McCulloch versus Maryland decision. So John Marshall, the Marshall Court, first of all said that, yes, within the powers of the Constitution, necessary and proper, it is legal for the federal government to create this bank. And this slide goes through some of the questions that were before the court when we were looking at this Supreme Court decision. States tried to force branches of the bank to pay a tax. And the one on the Maryland, and specifically the Baltimore branch, the bank there said, Bank of the U.S., to operate in Maryland, you have to pay a $15,000 tax. To which people who represented the Bank of the U.S. said, no, we don't. I mean, there's federal power and there's state power. So as the slide indicates, there are several answers. Did Congress have the right to charter a bank? Marshall said, yes. Was it constitutional? Yes. And the third question was, and this would have made Alexander Hamilton, if he wasn't dead at the end of that duel with Burr, very happy. Who has the power, the sovereign power in this case? Is it the federal government or is it the state government? And Marshall essentially said, in the opinion of the court, Congress has, and Hamilton would have loved this, implied powers. He also said, and this is the famous line from the decision, the power to tax involves the power to destroy, so the state cannot tax the national bank. The federal government, he says, was created not by the states, but by the people, which some people would still have disagreements with, constitutional scholars and people who lived in 1819. Nevertheless, it's what the Supreme Court said. So the McCulloch versus Maryland decision, two things. Number one, the bank is constitutional. Number two, Maryland cannot tax the Bank of the United States. The power to tax is the power to destroy. So, this is challenging the idea. The big issue, one of the two big issues during the so-called era of good feelings, is going to be whether or not one-party government can hold up. The panic challenges, and James Monroe is the only president, I think, in American history who, when there is an economic downturn, doesn't get blamed for it. Again, the panic was a depression. It lasted several years. There were other issues that he wanted to deal with, and the other unwelcome issue that he has to deal with, and this is the way that we connect to our next discussion, is what happens in the territory in the West. The Missouri Territory in 1819 applies for statehood, but there was a question about whether or not Congress could regulate whether or not Missouri joined the Union. It's the first territory to be carved out of the Louisiana Territory, not counting, of course, Louisiana. So it's the first new territory. And the question in 1819 was whether or not Congress can prevent or allow slavery in the Missouri Territory. Words like disunion, civil war, are thrown out in the halls of Congress over the Missouri debates. So next time we'll deal with the Missouri crisis. It's something that literally ground Congress to a halt for a period of 2 years and was an unwelcome story and what we call the so-called era of good feelings.